Good morning and a very warm welcome to all our guests here present, but also to all the participants who are connecting remotely to this hybrid event, which is, as you know, part of the final conference of the EUIDEA Horizon 2020 project. Yesterday and today, this conference has been discussing the theme of differentiation and integration in Europe from different perspectives. And this specific session will address the same topic, but this time from the democratic legitimacy angle, and will seek to unpack the relationship between differentiated integration and democracy. Together with our distinguished panelists, we will explore the extent to which differentiated integration helps or hinders the European Union's democratic legitimacy, and we'll do that by drawing on the results of the EUIDEA project, but also by reflecting on the EU's experience with past as well as ongoing crises. Several members of the EUIDEA consortium, all well-established experts in their respective fields, as well as a prominent MEP, are sitting on today's stellar panel and are ready to brave the topic of the session. It is my great pleasure to introduce to you Daniel Freund, member of the European Parliament for the group of Greens European Free Alliance, Funda Tekin, Director at the Institute for European Politics, Janis Emmanouilidis, Director of Studies at the European Policy Center, and Matteo, Bonomi, Research Fellow at the Institute for International Affairs. Many thanks to all of you for taking the time to contribute to our meeting today. The plan is to begin with a lively exchange on the panel. But since the goal is actually to have an overall interactive session, then I count on everyone in the audience here as well as online to raise questions and to react to what the speakers are saying. In the room, it will suffice to raise your hand if you wish to come in, and for our participants online, it will be possible for them to send us written questions only, but they can do so throughout the meeting at any time during the discussion that they want. Please, kind participants, use this prerogative, and I will try my best to wave in as many interventions from the public as I can and as we go. And with that, let's get started. And I would like to come first to Daniel Freund in order to ask, what do you personally understand by democratic legitimacy in a differentiated European Union, sir?
Hello, thanks for having me. Democratic legitimacy, of course, is, well, first and foremost, a functioning democracy where people can vote, those that sit in parliament and make the laws and can determine the government that leads the executive. And if they don't like what they're doing, they can vote them out at the next election. And I think if I understand the idea correctly, if you have some sort of multi-speed Europe where people have, or not people, where countries have different relationships with the European Union, well, the trouble you run into is, well, either you have members of the European Parliament, either you have commissioners, either your government sits at the table in the council or not, and that then determines whether you can hold those decisions that might impact you to account. For me, if you look at the relationship with Switzerland, for example, it has always been one of the things that I have never understood. If you talk to people, particularly in the democracy community, there's many advocates that say, look, Swiss democracy is the pinnacle of democracy. Yet my understanding of Swiss democracy is that for a large extent, when it comes to the rules that apply to their economy, to their companies, the Swiss market, well, those rules are written in Brussels, and the Swiss have no seat at the table. They have no vote in parliament. They have no commissioner, and they get sent all these laws, I don't know, by email, by fax, and then have to apply them. And I think that for me is not how I understand democracy, that you sort of at best are some sort of lobbyist that tries to influence that legislation from the outside. So I think particularly in the sense of democratic accountability, it's a very difficult question whether there is anything beyond full membership that assures full democratic legitimacy. If a country like Switzerland or Norway have decide we don't want to be in, you could say, well, that's still a democratic decision, but I'm one of those that believes there is not really a democratic choice on democracy. That shouldn't be a question that they could answer like that. So for me, they should strive for a seat at the table.
Mm-hmm. True, but of course, you know that there are also those who say that the EU derives its democratic legitimacy not only from from being accountable directly or indirectly to European citizens, but also through the effectiveness of decision making. So I wonder to what extent, in the end, good, effective policy making can compensate, if at all, for lack of accountability. And also, when it comes to democratic accountability, do you think that voting, because you mentioned voting, do you think that it's enough at this stage for ensuring accountability?
Voting isn't enough. Obviously, accountability in a democracy goes beyond that, but that's the ultimate and strongest tool. In the meantime, obviously, we can all, follow free media. We can have debates. We can have protests. We can have petitions. All those other tools of expressing that you want something, and then decision makers can react or not to that. But ultimately, it only ever works if there is that vote at the end, that says, I have petitioned you now for 4 years, you didn't listen, so now I'm voting you out. And just saying that you judge democratic accountability by the, whether the rules that come out are good rules, well, that's an argument you can make to say, well, China is good and democratic, right? As long as there is economic growth, it's all fine. I don't believe in that. I think that a functioning democracy and that accountability link is much more than just the right policy decisions.
Thank you. Matteo, maybe I come to you because if we are to go further on this issue of legitimacy, maybe we need to understand also better what we mean when we talk about differentiation. And I'm wondering if, based on the work that has been done in the EUIDEA project, you can tell us how you have deconstructed this concept and whether we speak of differentiation as a homogeneous concept or whether there are nuances and different types of it.
Thank you, Corina, for your question. I mean, I think many of current approach differentiation, and certainly your EUIDEA project share this approach, have been highlighted how differentiation can somehow bring some useful flexibility within EU complex machinery. What does it mean? It means basically two hypotheses we have been working with within EUIDEA. First, that differentiation may increase the responsiveness and the ability of the system to record preferences of different constituency within the EU, and different audience. It means, of course, the nation state, but not only. It can be subnational, as Piero was mentioning yesterday, but also beyond the member state somehow. So increase its input legitimacy. On the other hand, the other hypothesis was that differentiation may increase problem-solving capacity and therefore output legitimacy of the system across several policy fields. And what we have done within EUIDEA is try to take this to broader assumption and try to start to verify it in different policy sector, mainly across the three macro area where there is EU involvement in in politics, and how, or at least EU framework. And so which conclusion did we reach? And it's, of course, the picture is mixed. And in very, very general terms, I think we can say that we have verified quite that almost in any single case, there was an increasing of relative effectiveness of your action. At least there was the possibility to have an action even in some cases where otherwise wouldn't be possible. And so an increase of output legitimacy. At the same time, the chain of accountability, also of delegation and of accountability, were much, much more complicated in a differentiated policy as is the EU. However, I think even more interesting, we have seen a kind of variation of this general result of its intensity across two main dimensions, internal and external, formal and informal dimension. Just let me name, for example, just to give a brief overview. I know that we are short of time. I mean, internal formal differentiation, the classical example, the European Monetary Union, and we see how it is been evolving especially during this crisis, how maybe it's become a little bit more intergovernmental, and how sometimes also differentiated response that have been set in place have been outside the EU treaty. At the same time, as I think Eulalia was highlighting yesterday, there has been a multiple response that has been able to be reabsorbed within the European treaty. So you have probably not an optimal effective response, but you had some kind of response that was able to make the euro survive. And then you had also several accountability mechanisms in place in different area of the action. A second example, in external formal differentiation, the most classical, the European Economic Area. You have a quite dynamic system of alignment, so it's quite effective. It's not effective as for the member states, but at the same time, you have, because it's so formalized, you have at least some participation of a third country into this decision shaping of the EU and to the monetary information. There are some mechanism of accountability in place. Third example, internal informal differentiation. Yuka was mentioning yesterday, foreign policy, the leading groups, informal response, because the formal mechanism of differentiation were, for several reasons, have not been used. And we have shown how group of member states can still at least be present in some specific file, like the Normandy format, of course, or the nuclear talk with Iran, and so on. Of course, the outcome was still highly, probably was not sufficient, suboptimal. Probably the EU didn't have the assets to really make the difference, but at least this kind of informal differentiation were at least signaling the presence of the EU in those files. There was some internal coordination. At the same time, as we mentioned yesterday, as far as they were in line with the consolidated foreign policy talk within the EU, somehow they were at least to a certain extent legitimate. Of course, what was missing is the accountability mechanism. What if they did something else, the individual member states? Fourth example, external informal differentiation that we have been dealing with within the project is, I mean, the best example is informal deal, maybe in migration, to protect external border of the EU. Migration deal with Turkey or with Libya. Of course, very, I mean, short-term solution, quite ineffective and sustainable in the long run, and downgrading EU internal norm and standards.
Yeah.
This is
okay, thank you for these very concrete examples that expose the complexity, in fact, of the different forms of differentiation. Maybe I come to Funda to ask, because Based on the examples that we've heard from Matteo, could we say that the recent crisis, well, recent, we're talking about decades of crisis now for the EU, have this crisis in the sense made differentiation necessary, more important, and how has this affected democracy, the European Union's democratic legitimacy?
Yes, thank you for the question. And also, I think I would also like to relate to some of the points that my previous speakers have raised. I think with regards to the crisis, it of course always depends on the crisis in terms of whether differentiated integration will be increased or will not be increased. I think here I can also draw a bit on the research I did within the EUIDEA project with regards to narratives. And this also relates back to what we discussed in the first panel yesterday. Because of course, narratives can also be seen as a way of legitimization strategy by political actors. And we looked at different crises, if you want to speak, or times periods of increased political differentiation, and that was the one just before previous to the Big Bang enlargement, where the number of member states were basically almost doubling, and then also the crisis in the various crises in the Eurozone. And here we can see that the political unity was always kind of legitimized by the narratives, but with different plots or strategies behind it. So with the Big Bang enlargement, it was more basically a positive connotation. Yes, we can. So we basically can accommodate this challenge, and we are united in diversity. And with the crisis in the Eurozone, we rather had the opposite strategy. It was more divided in unity. But we must stick together, basically. So, and of course, this is something that is a general narrative that legitimizes political unity in spite of differentiated integration. The first one was more with regards to temporal forms, multi-speed, and the latter then more related to maybe even permanent forms of differentiation. But what I also think with regards to legitimacy of differentiation, and here I can relate to the second block of research I did in or coordinated within the EUIDEA project, and that was more the preferences of public opinion and political elites, because I think this is also a way of how you define legitimacy in terms of beliefs within a given constituency or other relevant audience, that a political institution's exercise of authority is appropriate. So if we have that definition in mind, of course, it is relevant what the public opinion thinks about differentiation. And but if I start first with the political elites, and here our findings basically echo what we discussed yesterday with regards to differentiated integration is something that is within the DNA of the European Union. It is acceptable and it should be a conscious choice in order to deepen integration. And then, of course, forms like enhanced cooperation are better than the real opt-outs that we discussed in our previous session. But then it's also interesting to see that you also have Eurosceptics that promote the idea of differentiated integration, of course, with a different aim and strategy behind it, and that is undermining the integration. And this is also something that was reflected in the public opinion poll. So you had Eurosceptics also promoting differentiated integration, although there was also a clear sign and trend that differentiated integration is rather supported or promoted by those that are in favor of more European integration. So differentiation and European integration is not a contradiction in itself. But here, and we also saw some north-south divides with regards to the economic and monetary union, deepening reforms in that policy area. But I think what I can highlight also with regards to democratic legitimacy and public opinion is basically two things. One, and this was very clear, is that in times of crisis, the public opinion demands unity. So not really differentiation, but rather solidarity and a united action. And a second thing, and this is maybe then also if we think about the conference on the future of Europe, this is a finding that I find very crucial, is that the understanding of the public opinion or of those respondents to our survey of differentiated integration was very vague, so to speak. So basically we found out that they had little understanding of the concept. And I think this is something that we have to keep in mind if we demand the public to basically judge on the effectiveness and accountability of differentiation.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, they were having a hard time distinguishing between the different institutions. So no wonder that they struggled with with this specific concept. But where do we stand now? Because I mean, we have a major crisis that is still unfolding, and of course, we're still dealing with the consequences of others as well, including the COVID. So, what can we expect in light of the war in Ukraine, for example, as the most urgent crisis on our hands in terms of differentiation, but also democracy?
Well, I think this is what we also discussed or started to discuss yesterday, because I think now, and this is what I said, you know, the public opinion basically demands unity, and this is also what we see. We see a strong surge of solidarity among the member states. But then when it comes to the different interests and national interests, I think we might see some trends of at least less solidarity and less unity. I'm not sure whether differentiated integration will then be the right answer to tackle this crisis. But we should at least then see whether it's more with regards to enhance cooperation or trying to circumvent some veto players. I think if that comes into play, differentiation might be the solution.
Thank you so much, Funda. Maybe I dare to come back to Mr. Freund, because of course the conference on the future of Europe was mentioned, and we know that you play an important role as observer of the executive board in this conference. And I'm wondering, do you think that the results of this exercise, which we will know with even more clarity than at present after 9th of May, will actually lead to more differentiation in Europe? And is it possible that we'll see more differentiation as well as more democracy as a result of having gone through this process, the conference process?
More differentiation, I don't think is decided yet. What I foresee currently happening is, well, the conference conclusions we're adopting in plenary the weekend after next. From everything I can tell from the working groups and where we are and the debate, there will be a list of things that require treaty change. European Parliament has just started the process of triggering Article 48. So Parliament has the ambition, and there's an agreement among the 4 large political groups, and I think even GUE is open to this. So there will be a majority in the Parliament for Parliament triggers Article 48, calls a convention, wants to debate treaty change. The idea is that still under the French presidency, if the election goes well on Sunday, but I think it looks, you know, way too close for comfort, but still good enough for going in the right direction, then there could still be a vote on this in the council under the French presidency. And the calling of the convention needs a simple majority, not qualified majority, not unanimity. So there is a real opportunity that we will have a debate on treaty change, like a real one, in a convention in the foreseeable future. How that debate will go over a year, 2 years, and how difficult it will be on a broader package to actually find unanimous agreement, I guess that will decide whether, you know, do we manage to keep the pack together, or will there be differentiation at that point, and will we try to move forward on some of these ideas, possibly with a smaller group. My conclusion from the last big debate we had when the MFF, the recovery fund, and the rule of law mechanism was negotiated was that the blockage of the Polish and the Hungarian veto disappeared the moment that there was serious reflection on differentiation. And that managed to keep everyone on board at the end. And I think the second lesson from that is we should not only be discussing changes to the treaties or like these formalistic rules, but we need money in the mix as well. Not that I'm suggesting that we should buy the votes, but it's a political compromise at the end that I think is facilitated if there is also discussion on a, whatever you want to call it, next generation 2.0 or a next package on investment, a debate that I think in any case we will have very, very soon, given the number of crises that you have mentioned.
And if a convention is in the cards, do you think that the conference exercise will make it important for the convention to incorporate participatory elements?
I think the participation of citizens in the conference and the way that we have done these, the randomly selected citizens panels has enabled us to be where we are right now. So I think I was one of the big proponents of that type of citizen participation, and for now I have to say, within the conference, this has really worked very well. I mean, I'm actually surprised myself how under these difficult circumstances, right? The citizens had very short time. They had enormously large topic areas, and they had to discuss this in 24 languages and stuff. That under these conditions, they have produced such good recommendations. I'm actually surprised myself. It worked even better than I would have thought. The part not in relation to the citizens' participation, but the part of the conference that has not worked so far is that outside of these confines around the EU institutions, far too few people have noticed what has been going on. I hope that if there is a signal now from the European Parliament that this is not just a paper that's going to the House of European History, but that there is something actually happening, that moment creates enough of an attention, that we can now use the momentum that we have created, thanks largely to the work of the citizens in the conference. And so saying now, look, thanks for all these recommendations. Now a couple of politicians are going to retreat behind a closed door. It's going to be a difficult argument to shut them out. And I think so far, civil society, the citizens' representatives, all this has helped the process. So why not continue along those lines? The treaty at the end is clear who takes the decisions. But this is the same functioning we've had in the conference so far. So I think keeping them in the room is probably a good idea.
Right. I want to come back to this idea of how we marry better in the future these participatory and representative dimensions. But before that, I want to bring Janis in and ask his opinion about the future, because we touched a bit on the past crisis, we mentioned a bit the present, but where do you think we're headed with differentiation? Will we see more or less of it, and with what consequences for democracy?
Thanks, Corina. If you look back, I'll start with that and then look into the future. We have seen that there have always been very strong links between the discussion about differentiated integration in its external and its internal dimension and democratic legitimacy. Already the Euro crisis was referred to. We had strong discussions as to whether the decisions which we're taking at certain levels between member states were reflected then also on the basis of democratic legitimacy. So we've had strong discussions about the link between differentiation and democratic accountability and legitimacy already in the past. And I think that, because you were asking about the future, I think that will increase, that we will have more of these debates as we progress. If we look into the current situation following the 24th of February, I think that in many ways we have not, and some of us in the European Union have not fully grasped the gravity of what happened on the 24th and the consequences of that for European integration. It requires to break with taboos of the past. In the previous session, there was a reference to enlargement. We need to think about enlargement in a different way than we've done in the past. It has now become, again, a strategic imperative. We need to think about energy policy, sustainability, and I could go on. The list is huge. What Zeitenwende, as Olaf Scholz coined it, will require to be done at the European level. And the unity which we've seen in the immediate aftermath of the 24th of February, which was remarkable if you compare it to other chapters of the perma-crisis, which we have witnessed over the past 10, 15 years, the unity and the speed of the EU 27 coming together has been remarkable. But I think we already see that that unity is under pressure. And if you take into account not only the immediate reaction to the war in Ukraine, which has now the top priority. But if you take into account the longer term things which have to be done at the European level, we will see that the differences between member states will become again stronger. They will become more visible in different areas, including also security and defense, which we were talking about yesterday. So if you get at that point in time, and now we're looking into the crystal ball, the question of differentiated integration will become again a question which will become stronger and will have to be discussed. I'm not saying that this will automatically lead to more differentiated integration in a very substantial way. It might also be used as a pressure function, as Daniel, you were alluding to. But the need to discuss and potentially also to implement differentiated integration potentially will become stronger. And then comes the question of how you will create a system which will have a level of democratic accountability and legitimacy which will be up to the standards which they're required to be. And that, I think, depends very much on what kind of scenarios one potentially foresees for differentiated integration in the upcoming next 10 to 15 years. In the paper I produced in the EUIDEA project, I came up with 5 scenarios of what differentiation might look like, macro scenarios might look like in future, and link it to what that might mean with respect to democratic legitimacy and effectiveness. And you obviously see that there would be potentially very different implications of the different scenarios on that. So if you look into the future, we have to have a discussion about in which differentiated integration future do we want to go to? How much of it do we want? And actually, we often have, no, that's the last sentence at this point for me. In the past decades, we've always discussed about differentiation of ways of overcoming the obstruction of certain member states to be ready to go in a certain direction. But I think we need to have more of a debate about whether those who we call the pro-Europeans, the pro-EU forces, are ready to do the steps needed, which might also include differentiation inside or outside the treaties. There are different forms, as we all know. And we're having too much of a discussion about those who are not willing to do things rather than on those who pretend to be ready to do more at the European level, even if that requires a higher level of differentiated integration or differentiated cooperation, and whether they're actually ready to do so. Because we see a lot of nice Sunday talks when it comes to how far we want to go, and also, if need be, also do it among a smaller group of countries. But when Monday reality comes in, and we see that in security and defense, but we see that in many areas, we see that member states who call themselves pro-European and being viewed as pro-European are not ready to make the next step, which potentially might require also differentiation. So there's a lot which needs to be discussed and will have to be discussed, and that will have a link to differentiation and legitimacy, which are two sides of the same coin.
But do you think that we can, I mean, you mentioned we will have to decide how much differentiation we want, how much differentiation we want, and is it possible to think about it as a one size fits all? I mean, will it depend on the areas, on the policy areas under discussion? How is it possible to make such a judgment call in advance? And also, what I'm wondering is, you mentioned some policy areas like foreign policy, energy, enlargement, and so on. do you think that getting to deal with these policy areas and to advance and move forward and find solutions to these topics will also require that as a first step that we look at the system, for example, in an institutional sense, and how decision making happens before we even start tackling the policy issues as such. I mean, a bit a complex question, but you
No,
get
good.
my drift.
I get your drift. I think what we've seen over the past decades is that differentiation has never been the silver bullet. It's not the answer to all the problems we're having. It is an instrument. And if there's a need to progress and not all member states are on board, using the instrument should be and is an option. And even if it's an option only to make sure that almost all member states participate, so the pressure function we discussed earlier. But then the question is, what kind of differentiation are we talking about? And that, I think, is a big question with respect to also when we address how we will deal with the challenges we now have after the 24th of February in future, of what kind of differentiation would we actually want and require? Is it something which should be based on the instruments we have within the EU treaty framework? Is it something which is more informal? Do we need also for a certain period differentiation outside the EU treaty framework while this group of countries progressing form a kind of an intergovernmental avant-garde, having in mind that they want to include institutions, want to integrate differentiation into the EU framework. So there are different ways of differentiation, which have been very thoroughly analyzed in the EUIDEA context, which you have to have in mind when you are then addressing the question of how helpful differentiation could be. However, I think as the optimal scenario is not differentiation. Now, the optimal scenario is that we have unity, that we progress together, while not falling into the trap of the lowest common denominator. But differentiation has a role to play, has played a role in the past, and it will play also a role in future.
Funda, I see that you want to come in, please.
Yes, I think we thought that we should disagree on this panel, but actually I can only add to what you said and underline what you said, because I think this is exactly it. It is a tool, but I think we also have to, if we ask the question of how much, and we rather should ask, in which areas it is rather advisable to use or recur to differentiated integration or differentiation. And that is, to me, always asking the question, is it going to have centripetal or centrifugal forces that come out of it? And I mean, yesterday we were all agreeing on that there are some certain areas that are non-differentiable, like rule of law, single market. And I think this was also in the Brexit debate very clear that the single market and its 4 freedoms are not to be differentiated, although there were, this continental partnership concept and so on and so forth. So there were ideas regarding this differentiation. So for me, it's rather really the question of, either centripetal or centrifugal effects. And so I think also we discussed that in the previous panels, the issue of opt-outs. I don't think that opt-outs are going to be the main form of differentiated integration that we're going to see in the current future, but it's more about enhanced cooperation, the informal coalition of the willing, or outside the treaty framework, in order to have, some sort of centripetal effects. And I think PESCO is a good example that in the end really attracted a whole lot of member states. So I think this is something to also keep in mind when we think about how much and in which areas.
Thank you, Funda. How much is desirable? Matteo, I see that you want to come in.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I mean, if we see the last 2 crises, probably your answer, response of also the members has been different, has been much more solidarity and unity. However, these have been ad hoc solution, and is exactly how to transform this ad hoc unity in a more permanent, sustainable institutional arrangement. And this is exactly here where differentiation may come in as an instrument. Internally, of course, to deepen the union, but eventually also to put pressure on others to proceed together. But still it will remain essential, I think, for the external phase, even if the treat of differentiate can help to make substantial leap forward in new integration process internally. I think this is fundamental also to have a European Union that is more open towards its neighborhood. current form of external differentiation simply do not fit current needs of the European Union. We cannot propose to countries that are fighting for democracy to just take our legislation as a membership minimum status at the end of the project, but then it will be extremely complicated to immediately integrate them into the European Union. At the same time, the enlargement model that we have been experiencing as a general framework for cooperation, as with the Western Balkans, simply do not help to fit current needs, even EU-Western Balkan relations, where also this cooperation has keep much more intense, informal, but not along those lines that we would like to see for a democratic union. I mean, it's not only that the result is not a full democratization of EU partners, but the policy you are practicing with this third country is not democratic. And so this is quite problematic. And I think in this, we should really start to be able to distinguish among those neighbors that wants to become full member, and maybe will require time, but you need to find inroads to much more include them through solidarity, first of all, but also to much bigger participation in and be part entirely as much as they can in your current policy. And this, I think, is fundamental to deepen first the Euro, at the same time to deepen for the Union, but also to be much more serious about the enlargement. And if it's not full membership that you gain immediately, you need to be very inclusive in your way, in the alternative you propose. I mean, especially when you integrate economically poor countries that basically have not a choice in the economic policy that they're implementing. We see this in the enlargement country in the Western Balkans. I mean, they have been most European in their economic, in applying austerity policy that many European member states. It's just the structural links that they have with us are already so strong that they just follow they mimic our policy already.
Even if differentiation would be an option in relations with neighbors, so with potential prospective new members, is it really an option for the Balkans? Can we go back at this point in time and tell them, well, actually, it's not full membership that's on the table anymore, but a gradual process that may or may not lead eventually to full membership?
Two thoughts about this. Of course, with the Balkans, we just simply go too far. I mean, they should be fully integrated. And they are so small that, I mean, they became the scapegoat of the deepening versus widening debate. They are such a small country that budgetary and it's more a symbol of than the. But then you need what show clear, I think, the Balkans is we should get rid of constructive ambiguity. I mean, it get very little short-term gain. It creates long-term unsustainable relation and a lot of frustration. So constructive ambiguity that Europe has been often using with its neighborhood simply does not work. We should change our approach, and we should have clarity and when possible, inclusion and solidarity with our neighbors.
Right, except that we raise the bar so high that I wonder if it's possible to be clear, and if it's possible for these countries to actually ever meet the conditions that we've set on them. But I see that Mr. Freund wants to come in.
Yeah, I wanted to go exactly on that point, because obviously, from the point of view of the founding members, we have had over 60 years of integration. And so for a new member to join today is obviously a very different thing than in the 60s, 70s, 80s it was. So I think having something that sort of ladder that allows you to do that rather than take that one huge step is of course something I think we should reflect on more, without that becoming a disincentive for those that want to join, then to be said, well, you remain on this step and you cannot proceed to the full membership. I think on the other side of that plateau that current members are on, however, I would be very afraid to have a similar ladder for member states to opt out of certain things. I mean, if I think about it as a sort of cliff edge that we build, and the Brits still decided to jump over it, but that in a way signaled to everyone else that this is not a path that anyone wants. it's not a cliff edge that anyone else wants to try to somehow overcome. And I think that's useful. And if I think about people like Orban or Janša, if Janša had the possibility to say, I want to now opt out of the European Public Prosecutor, for example, he would have done so. If there were these kind of possibilities to come back on enhanced cooperation or on integration steps, for me, in a way, it comes back to ever closer union. For me, this should be more of a one-way street. You can only ever go towards more integration with the cliff edge possibility of leaving the union altogether. But that is so scary that hopefully we preserve the ever closer union path. And then if we have to deal with governments that have very different ideas about the union for a while, at least they cannot destroy the whole integration process for their country. Well, and then comes another government again and takes the next steps of integration without holding up the whole union in the meanwhile. I think that's sort of how I would think about it strategically, that we facilitate the moving forward, but not allow anyone, because I think, don't tell any of the Eurosceptics, but if we would allow partial opt-outs or different forms of membership levels where you can then say, oh, I don't like this, I don't like that, then it becomes very dangerous for the union really quick.
And how can you decide on what's to be opted out and what's not? Things are so interconnected. It becomes a very slippery slope. I don't see any questions online. I wonder if there are any in the room. Okay, maybe. Okay, we'll bring two of our participants in. Three. Okay, we'll collect a few and then I come back to the panel. I will give you the floor. Maybe we start from the lady with the green jacket. I will try to be fair and give you the floor in the order in which I saw the hands raising.
Okay, thank you very much. Sen Aydın from Sabancı University. Now, I'm very happy that the issue of enlargement policy came up, and especially external differentiation. But what I'm thinking about is this. What Matteo said is true. Of course, it's very difficult, for instance, to say to the Western Balkans, okay, enlargement is off the table. But can't we think about a more innovative sort of EU policy where enlargement and different forms of external differentiated integration are not thought of or conceptualized as mutually exclusive processes? They can go in hand, and in my opinion, they should to some extent. But the problem there, I think, which the EU has to think about, is how to give third countries a voice in the actual decision-making in the policies to which they're subject to. And the reason why I'm making this comment is because, I worked a lot on EU-Turkey relations in the past, for instance, and there's a huge problem that, the EU has tried for so many years to formulate some kind of privileged partnership with Turkey, and that never worked, and nothing came out, because the Turks would not accept anything that would not give them a voice in the designing of the customs union or external commercial policy and things like that, that would make them subject to EU rules without a voice in decision-making. Now that, of course, I know is a very difficult endeavor, and it would require treaty change and all sorts of things, but also looking at the way in which we now are discussing the prospective membership of Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, post-Erdogan Turkey, in which the opposition will come automatically knocking on EU's doorstep for the reconstruction of the country with EU values or whatever that might mean, what the EU will do, what kind of tools will it have? I think this is an extremely important question, and I would like a few reflections perhaps on the feasibility of that. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. Lucas, we'll go here. Just in front. No?
Yeah, thank you. Vivian Schmidt, Boston University. So yeah, wonderful panel. Lots of really interesting and important issues raised. And I'm going to add to, I'm going to pick up on this because I think the issue of differentiated integration with regard to future potential members or neighbors is really, really important. And it also speaks to how can one conceive of differentiated integration. And if you think about it, if you think about how much differentiation is already there with different clusters of member states in different policy communities forming what I see as this kind of a soft core, the question is, rather than seeing membership as binary, you're in or out, why not some kind of graduated membership or incremental membership? But that would mean actually giving voice and vote. So voice perhaps in most areas in which countries see themselves entering, but then vote in the policy communities in which they participate. So we heard about Switzerland earlier. Norway is another example. They participate across the single market. Why not give them voice and vote in those areas? Security and defense, we heard about the UK earlier. Hopefully in a post-Johnson government, the UK will come back to a joint security and defense. Why not give them not just voice, but vote in that area, even though they're not part of the normal? So my question is that feasible? Are there legal problems involved? But it seems to me that that's really key. And so just one other issue, because Daniel mentioned this in terms of accountability, and we can think about political accountability in terms of citizens, but there's also a kind of procedural accountability, having a forum to hold EU institutions to account. And I think that's where the Parliament is the key forum. And yet in many very important policy communities, as in the Eurozone, as in foreign policy when we're dealing with the Ukraine crisis, the Parliament is barely there. So another question would be, how does one increase that?
Thank you so much. And final third question, and then we come back to the panel.
Thanks. I also find this very interesting. Being from Norway, I also probably have to pick up on some of this. Now, I think that Brexit has made the distinction between members and non-members more important and salient. And so that's sort of my starting point. And I also think that there is a distinction between differentiated integration, external differentiation and external differentiated integration. That should be more clarified, because external differentiation, in my view, is basically norm adoption from somebody outside, whereas external differentiated integration is about reciprocal obligations and rights. And I think that this is something that is very clear in the EEA case, that you have reciprocal rights and obligations, so that you're included in EU programs in a different way. And for citizens, this matters, because it means that EEA citizens are economic citizens of the EU. And this is a distinctive arrangement. And my thesis is that if the EU were to become more similar either to an intergovernmental organization or to a normal federation, this type of flexibility and the form of external differentiated integration would diminish. So the irony is that if the EU becomes more standard in democratic terms, there would be less scope for this type of inclusiveness that the EU has. So this would be my thesis that I would like to ask you about. I also had another issue, and that has to do with the form of democratic paternalism that is embedded in the external relations. External differentiation or external differentiated integration is really about democratic paternalism, because the states are adopting democratically authorized decisions from the EU. So this is an interesting democratic question. Which issues in a situation of complex interdependence, which issues does a democratic demos need to have say on, and which issues can it allow to other organs and so on to determine democratically on its behalf? It's a sort of a twist on virtual representation, basically. So I think this raises these types of issues, because if you look at the world, many of the decisions that we are adopting in terms of even the metric system, you have the UK and metric martyrs, I mean, this wonderful notion. So a lot of decisions that we are adopting in democratic societies that are not necessarily democratically authorized. So how to distinguish between these? Thanks.
Thank you so much. I know that Janis wants to come in, but I also know that Mr. Freund has to be in the parliament by 12. So if you want, I can allow you to answer some of the questions that have been raised. And I know that we've had at least one that was specifically invoking the parliament's role in creating more accountability for the EU. So I give you the chance, then the floor first.
Well, first, the question about Norway, Switzerland, why wouldn't they get a vote? Well, that's up to them, right? Both countries have decided that they don't want to join the union. We cannot force them to sit at the table, but it's they need to fill out a membership request, send it to Brussels, and then you know, there is a seat at the table if they want it. I'm pretty sure. So that's basically the deal. I don't understand why you wouldn't ask for that seat. You know, if you can have a vote in the council, if you can have your members in the European Parliament, why wouldn't you take them? If already you apply the laws, if already you pay, you know, your membership fees, so to speak, on the whole differentiated integration from the outside again. The deal that we have, for example, with Switzerland, you know, I think the viewpoint from the EU is now we really cannot do that with everyone around us in that way. And particularly if we would say to our members as well, every member state now gets to decide which projects, for example, they want to fund with their money, because that's a deal we have with Switzerland, right? They get to decide in terms of the structural funds and so on, where their money goes and which projects they accept. I mean, that would be complete mayhem if 27 members now each individually decide, me as German government, I think now I want to fund these things, and the French fund those, and the Portuguese those other things. I mean, the coherence that we have by the European Commission based on decisions we take in the Parliament and in the Council to decide what projects we fund makes imminent sense and is, in a way, the heart of European integration, right? So that's always the decision we have to take. Yes, differentiation allows us to go forward where otherwise we maybe wouldn't be allowed or able to move forward, but it also makes the structure more complicated. That answers your questions in a way. Yeah, we can think about innovative ways of, you know, organizing our relationship with Turkey, but we shouldn't forget about those citizens that are already inside the union and that need to understand, you know, how do our institutions work? How do we, you know, I mean, in the conference, the first thing they suggested, please rename your institutions. We don't understand between the Council of Europe, the Council of the European Union, the European Council. There's just too many councils. We have no idea what they do. And, you know, that's what you get with innovation and thinking creatively about things. So it's a balance that you need to strike. The European Parliament holding stuff to account, there's a lot more that we have to do. There's also, there's frictions, let's say, between things that the European Parliament loves to ask for, more powers, inquiry committees, and the right of initiative, and us not using the powers that we already have. And what happened after the European elections in terms of us in the Parliament not being able to elect a Spitzenkandidat and leaving that to the Council to decide was a huge loss of influence and power, and where we gave something away that we shouldn't have given away. And so if we in the Parliament behave like that, you know, then we lose influence. We lost influence on the recovery fund where we have no say. It was a power game. We had to decide to some degree, you know, what our priorities are, and getting everything in a moment of crisis where economies are collapsing in parts of Europe is a difficult call to make. But, you know, giving up the powers that you have or might have is a problematic thing to do as well. And I think there have been stronger parliaments in the past, and there's a whole host of reasons, the way that the elections work, the way that party lists are currently made in a number of member states, and how some of the you know, even group leaders are heavily influenced by their heads of government at home. The large share of new members that came in after the elections, all this played some role, but we need a parliament that also asserts the powers that it should have.
Thank you so much. And just before you leave us, I will ask you a question that I will try to ask the other panelists as well, with the understanding that there is no silver bullet, as Janis mentioned, or a magic solution. But if you were to think of one change or one reform that we could undertake next, based on where we are and what we've learned from everything that has happened until now, that could make a difference for European democracy and the European project, what would it be, in your opinion? I mean, if you had to just select one.
Yeah, very easy. Get rid of unanimity. That's the biggest design flaw we have in the union. It's what makes it undemocratic, because in a way the tight majority in the tiniest member state can block the whole union, even if 95% of EU citizens want something. It doesn't happen. So unanimity is what needs to go.
And how feasible is that? Can it happen?
I mean, it has happened in a lot of areas. It's just that maybe the most important ones, big ones, remain. But I think particularly on security issues, on foreign policy, we see at the moment the danger of one member state being able to block us even having a position on Russia invading Ukraine. I don't think we should run that risk ever again.
Thank you so much. I will now turn to Janis. Thank you for your patience. But I want to, okay, then thank you. Thank you very much for your participation, Mr. Freund. Janis.
Thanks. I want to pick up the point raised by Senna and by Vivian with respect to ways affiliating countries who wish to join the European Union before they can become full members. These are not alternatives. It's how you get from here to there. And the thinking about that is very old. I remember having these discussions 15, 20 years ago in a different world we were living at the time. And people also trying to conceptualize how alternative forms of belongings below full membership could look like. And there are also now some conceptual reflections which are happening as we speak. But when you think these things through, they hit the wall when two things come up. One is, do and are these countries allowed to be participating in the EU's internal decision-making process? That's where those who are already in the club say that's too much. And the second issue is money. And the combination of money and decision-making powers, or the ability to actively influence decision-making within the European Union, has been used as an argument in the past to say there's a limit of how far you can go beyond a mere association plus. But I think if we would creatively think about alternatives, there are these alternatives. And if you think of these alternatives and you come to the conclusion, and member states come to the conclusion that this is not something they want, it increases the pressure on them to accept that, okay, if that's not an option, or not an option now, then you actually have to be serious about EU enlargement. And we have not been serious about EU enlargement for many years. And I think what has now changed after the 24th of February is that from enlargement being considered as an internal function among the EU27, how will it affect us if we further enlarge? Now it has again become a strategic imperative, because we are now under pressure to provide an answer to those who are asking to actually become members of the Union, who are already part of that process, look at the Western Balkans, but also those who are now knocking on our door and saying we want to be part of your club, especially Ukraine. So it will force us to actually, if we think of these alternatives, to be frank and serious about EU enlargement in future, which also means that we, the EU27, have to change a lot to prepare ourselves for that moment in time. So it would increase the pressure on us. So I think we need to think about alternative forms of belonging below EU membership, even if they don't materialize, in order to put pressure both on the issue of EU enlargement and EU reform. And just a second point. When Funda was talking about the centripetal and centrifugal potential effects of differentiated integration, I think what clearly came to my mind is the strong link between the effectiveness of differentiated cooperation integration forms and legitimacy. And yes, you said that people want, especially in crisis moments, that the EU shows a high level of unity, but they want the EU to show a high level of unity, aspiring that the EU then will be able to deliver. But if you get into a situation where the EU, the member states collectively are not able to deliver, and that undermines legitimacy and democratic accountability of the EU. And that's where differentiation comes into play. So there's a clear link between effectiveness and democratic legitimacy, which we should always have in mind. And Daniel was saying earlier that we need to be careful when it comes to differentiation and arguing that delivery is utmost important, because that could mean that other systems could be alternatives to liberal democracy. I would counter that argument. I think there is a strong link between delivery, effectiveness, and democratic accountability and legitimacy. And we should have that in mind in the discussion we will have to have about differentiation in the future, and I'm sure it will come up.
Okay, but even if there is more of a need to deal with current applicants and also with new countries knocking at our doors, this doesn't mean that all of the risks and pressures associated with absorbing these countries and digesting their integration go away. So those are still there. And the other thing that comes to my mind is that even if you have an incremental process, the problem with the current enlargement process is also that the to-do list for these countries, the conditionality that we've laid out to prepare them, is not really working. So even if you were to break it into smaller pieces, or create a ladder-like process, the question of what actually you ask them and how you prepare them to move from one step to the other, in my opinion, still remains. So it's not just a question of adjusting the process, but also the substance of the process, if that makes any sense.
No, this pressure does remain.
Yeah.
The necessity to prepare for enlargement, it requires the preparedness on our side and on the side of those who are joining or want to join the club. But what we lack is credibility, because we have told them that you have a perspective to join the European Union, but we all knew that with the EU won't enlarge. We're not ready for it. We don't want to. We have had negative experiences. So that undermines the ability to assert pressure also domestically within these countries to reform themselves. So we undermine our own ability from the outside to have an effective pressure mechanism on them, but also those who within these countries want their countries to join the European Union don't have strong arguments, because they always have to say, well, enlargement actually is not in the cards, and people behind closed doors and even in front of closed doors are telling us there won't be any enlargement because we're not ready for it. So as long as you have that credibility problem, you're right in terms of your analysis. But that's why I think that what has happened on the 24th of February changes the ballgame and must change the ballgame.
Yeah, and of course, if we revise anything, it has to be revised for everyone, because otherwise you're creating a different set of problems. Funda, I know you want to.
Yes, I think I can only kind of also continue the line of thoughts, because I think Daniel Freund's answer was very clear with regards that there is no such thing like partial membership, and you gave the reasons for that, why this currently is not the case. But I think if, and this is also the reason why I always talk about external differentiation instead of external differentiated integration. And I think what we really now need to consider with regards to now also giving Ukraine the perspective, Georgia, Moldova also being in the loop, the Western Balkans. And if we then speak about, this incremental process, a ladder approach, I think we really have to think about and detail out how we get from external differentiation to external differentiated integration, if we really want to do that. And this has also already been said. I think it has to be clear that this open-ended procedure of accession, of the accession process cannot really, or is not really helpful in this end. And I think in the end, it needs to be clear that if you move up the ladder, you will have to implement the full acquis as a new member, because this is, and here I rather agree with Daniel Freund, starting, the ladder approach can be the ladder into the European Union, but it should not be a ladder outside the European Union. And this is what we discussed with regards to Le Pen in the previous panel, because once we start simply, a new government can decide, I'm not going to be willing to participate in certain policy areas, I'm going to opt out of that. we're going to have a back and forth and a l'Europe à la carte, which is not something that we actually want. So I think this is something that we need to consider, and we really have to answer this question of how to kind of allow for some sort of partial membership on the ladder into the European Union. And I think this is now the opportunity to actually do it.
And what it would mean in practice, actually. Who would want it also? Matteo.
Thank you, Corina. I mean, more innovative form of differentiation externally. I mean, the key issue here, I think, is really to distinguish between those that can but do not want, and those that want but cannot. And today, the maximum closeness that you have externally is with those that can but do not want. And we should be able to bring those that want but cannot more close, I think. And in that we can work. And there we can find inroads within a different level of European institution without devaluating the value of membership, because this is the danger.
Who wants and can't?
Sorry?
More specifically.
I mean, if you look at, for instance, how much has been evolving, for instance, a relation between the EU and the Western Balkans in the last 10 years, despite the enlargement policy framework has not really meant to enlarge. It was since 2011, simply the credible perspective was not there. It's been for more than 10 years. Today, they are much more integrated in the European Union than they were 10 years ago. And it happened much more at an informal level. In terms of cooperation, if you can see at their economic policy, you can see in police cooperation, in participation in new agency, and so on. But this goes under there. It's not the usual integration through law. It's integration through policy, and there is really, really strong connection now. And we see in basically all aspects. But this go under the radar, and it's rather and outside any form of accountability. I think on all these aspects, we should find a way to somehow to make them part of not only of our policy, but at least in a progressive way of our decision making, especially in what we have not shown is solidarity. I mean, we ask for the less development part of the European Union to become part of our competitive market. And then we have not transferred to correct. I mean, we have transferred among the member states to correct market failures. And we know how much is a key, and we have I mean, at least for the weakest part of the union, we have fiscal transfer, and we have been having since at least Eastern enlargement. Yeah. And we need also with this kind. I mean, it's just simply impossible to have a process of economic convergence without greater economic solidarity of a kind that we already seen within the member state, and this should definitely come much before a full membership of the European Union, at least if we want to have a process of convergence.
Okay, we have 3 minutes and 3 speakers. Unfortunately, I cannot take any more questions, but I will ask the same question that I asked Mr. Freund to each of you and give you the 50 seconds to answer it. So one thing that we could do now as we move forward, taking on board the lessons learned and the context in which we live that could help democracy and the European project. Funda.
Yes, well, I thought about it, and I actually also came up with the conclusion that Daniel Freund had. It's the qualified majority voting, because simply I think that is a measure of avoiding differentiated integration in terms of if you have certain veto players. However, I think I need to put that also into context, because well, we are aware of that the council usually tries to take decisions with consensus, even though there is the opportunity for QMV. And for me, the example always that it's kind of also then QMV itself does not solve the problem is the decisions of in September 2015 on the redistribution of asylum seekers here in the European Union, where the decision was taken by QMV, which was totally to the rules of the treaties, but then the implementation was very poor because Hungary and other countries were outvoted and then not willing to implement. And I think this is something that we have also to keep in mind, that QMV might at least solve the problem of finding decisions, but then we also have to ensure mechanisms of implementing.
Thank you so much. Matteo.
I mean, it's impossible to answer your question, but probably, I mean, especially in this context of, common foreign security policy, we should, of course, it will also in the future rely a lot on individual member state, but I think we should find form to better institutionalize this relationship also, where when member states are dealing with specific file, to make them accountable and to have a real common foreign policy, even if maybe not completely centralized, and making the best use of different actors, but in that I think, and is still I mean, we just didn't use the instrument of differentiation, the integration that we had at disposal, and we see, unfortunately, because the outcome and the performance of this policy has been probably the weakest in the European Union.
And last but certainly not least, Janis.
Well, my answer will not be innovative. And there clearly is not one thing that would have to be done in order to solve all our problems. And I don't believe, for example, that introducing QMV would be that solution. But you asked about the lessons learned, and the lessons learned, or the lesson we should have learned from the previous chapters of the perma crisis we're living through, is that we need to prepare for the worst to avoid the worst. And if you translate that into the current crisis we're going through in terms of what we need to do with respect to reacting to the multiple consequences of the 24th of February, prepare for the worst to avoid the worst will mean that a lot will have to be done at the European level. The level of ambition we will have to show if we want to adequately react to what is happening will be enormous compared to what we've done in the past. So my biggest wish is that on the 24th of this month, the right person will be elected in France, and then Paris and Berlin will get their act together, because they need to get their act together. And unfortunately, my mother country, Germany, is struggling with that. The coalition agreement says something else with respect to Europe, compared to what reality is showing. And Berlin is lagging behind. And that is bad news from a German perspective, from a European perspective. And I hope that will change. And we have a lot of pressure to change it. And I hope that after the 24th, it will also help Berlin to get over some of the reservation which it has in the immediate reaction to the crisis and to the war in Ukraine, but also with respect to what needs to be done beyond that, which is a long list of to-dos.
Thank you very much, Janis. 24 again, a very fatalistic number this year. Hopefully, this one will bring more positive news. We have exhausted the time of our discussion, but I want to thank very much our online audience, as well as you for your attention and participation. And please join me in thanking our speakers for the wonderful contributions. And just the final line that each of you mentioned warrants a full discussion in itself. So this is a conversation that certainly we need to continue. Thank you very much, and a wonderful day to everyone. Join me in thanking our speakers, please.